Welcome to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast with Tom Rosenbauer, bringing you tips, tricks, and techniques to help you get the most from your time on the water. Here's acclaimed fly fishing author and lifelong fly fishing enthusiast, Tom Rosenbauer.
This is part 3 of Reading the Water, and now I'd like to talk a little bit about specific discrete places in the stream. We talked a little bit about trout and their feeding behavior. We talked a little bit about hydraulics in general and how they affect where a trout lives. And now let's talk about things like logs and rocks and sweepers in a stream. The classic case of reading the water is a big midstream rock. And where do the trout lie in relation to that rock? The rocks are kind of neat because if they protrude above the water, they're very obvious places, and you can see the rock and you can see where the trout somewhere, there's going to be a trout somewhere in the area. And even if that big rock is underwater, you can see the dimple or the bump in the surface of the water, which is always going to be a little bit downstream of the rock. You have to remember that because the current pushes that swirl downstream. Classic midstream rock. So what happens? The water comes downstream, it hits the front of the rock, and there's actually a dead spot in front of the rock because of the molecules piling up in front of the rock will actually create a dead spot there. And there's also some turbulence created, which will dig a little trench in front of the rock. So there's a spot in front of the rock, and often these spots are better and more comfortable for a trout than a spot behind the rock. You got the sides of the rock, the water flows around the sides of the rock, does the same thing. Some friction's created, a little turbulence is created, and it'll dig out a little trench along the side of the rock. And then, of course, you got the classic behind the rock spot where there's a big swirl, there's some turbulence, the bottom gets dug out, and a trench is formed behind the rock. Conventional wisdom says that the trout are going to be behind the rock, and they might be. But in my experience, and in the experience of lots of other fishermen who are smarter than I am, trout will just as likely to be found in front of the rock or on the sides of a rock as behind a rock. Now, when you have a little tiny rock on the bottom, this doesn't really matter because you're going to put your fly somewhere in the general vicinity, and whether the trout's in front or behind the rock, you're still going to see the fly and you're going to grab it. So it doesn't really matter. So where you have a big rock, when you have a big rock in the middle of the river, you're not going to be able to cover the entire rock with one cast. And, of course, you want to make all your casts count. And usually your first cast in an area is your best cast, and you want to place that where you're most likely going to find a trout because every cast after that has a potential of spooking them. A big boulder creates a dead spot behind it. It strains all the food from the current. And as we learned in some of the other podcasts, trout need to be in a place where they can pick food out of the drift constantly throughout the day. Behind a big rock, downstream of a big rock, there's not much food because it all gets pushed off to the sides. So placing your cast behind a big rock often might result in nothing because the trout are more likely to be in front of the rock or along the sides of the rock where not only do you have some protection from the current, but you have food being pushed by at a fairly rapid rate. In the same light, where you have a sweeper or a tree that's fallen into the water and leans into the current, you're a lot more likely to find trout in front of that sweeper or off the tip of the sweeper, the outside tip or the tip that extends most into the current, then you are way in behind those branches of the sweeper. Because what that sweeper does is acts like a strain, and it strains all the food out of the water. And a trout that's living behind that sweeper, downstream of it, is not going to get much food. A lot of protection, a lot of places to hide from predators, but very little food. They're in a dead zone. So when you're fishing something like this, any kind of log or protection from the bank, you're more likely to find a feeding fish in front of it or out on the end of it than directly behind it. So I hope after these last 3 podcasts you know a little bit more about reading the water. Just remember that it's not a skill that you can easily get from reading a book, or even not a skill that you can get from having a helpful, experienced fly fisher at your side. It's more of a learned experience through observation, and I find that the more observant the person, the easier they catch on to reading the stream. So try to remember, every time you go fishing and you catch a fish, try to remember where you caught that fish and why. After you catch it and release it, enjoy it, sit down for a minute, look at the water and say, okay, why was that fish living there? What was it about the current or the protection or the food supply that made this trout live there? And if you do this every time, or at least try to make a quick mental note, you'll fast be on your way to becoming an expert in reading the water. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast with Tom Rosenbauer. Since 1856, anglers worldwide have counted on Orvis to help them get the most from their time on the water. To learn more and to shop the world's finest fly fishing gear, including the award-winning zero-gravity Helios rod, visit www.orvis.com/podcast.